Keep it rolling. Keep it going. Go! Fuck! Holy shit.
Dr. Pack here with my friend and partner in crime, Dr. Milo Wolf, on the skyscrapers of New York, getting ready for a grueling leg workout. We were challenged to do this workout for $1,000. For those of you that don't know, there was a new study that came out that essentially looked at whether adding sets every few weeks is better than not adding sets. And in that study, the people that worked out essentially started with 22 sets of quads. So they did some squatting, some leg pressing, and some leg extensions. And the highest volume group by the end of the study ended up doing 52 sets just for their quads, split in 2 sessions.
Now you may be thinking, 52 sets per week for one muscle group? That's kind of a lot. Well, they separated this volume into 2 weekly sessions. So in the last 2 weeks of the study, they performed 9 sets of squats, 9 sets of leg press, and 8 sets of leg extensions twice a week for 52 total sets. Today, we'll be attempting one of these sessions. Now, for some context, Pak, what's your recent lower body training been like?
So for the past year or so, I haven't done more than 2 to 4 sets for quads. Now, those sets came either from leg press or some front squatting, but I've just been maintaining my quads for the past year and focusing really on my deadlift. Historically, I've squatted near 600 pounds and have been a relatively strong squatter, but at the time, my 1RM max for squat I'd say is around 440, 200 kilos, so nothing too crazy.
Nice.
And you?
Me, I've been doing a few lower body sessions a week. I would say on average, my quad volume has been about 10 sets per week, 12 sets per week. So pretty low volume still. Most of those sets being pretty close to failure, but nevertheless. Needless to say, neither of us has built up to this really high volume, right? Yeah. In this study, the participants that ended up doing 52 sets quad a week were gradually building up to it over about 10 to 11 weeks. So they gradually went from 22 sets a week to 52 sets a week over 10 weeks. They have plenty of time to get used to this stuff. Yes. On the other hand, we didn't really have that. But the good Lyle McDonald posed a challenge to us, saying that if anyone could complete one of these 26 set quad sessions, he would reward them with $1,000. The only caveat being he needed a full uncut video of us performing this session, and we need to do our best to perform it. So that's what we're doing today.
Exactly.
Now, in preparation for this session, we have done a sort of acclimation session. You wanna?
Just one session. So we essentially went to the gym and did 2 sets of squats each, 6 to 8 reps at 0 to 2 reps in reserve. Closer to 2 reps in reserve than 0. So that's all we've done. We did that a day ago. As far as being prepared for the sessions, we're definitely not. But at the same time, this is supposed to serve a greater purpose than just $1,000 from Lyle.
Or is it?
Or is it?
Side hustle salary?
We are in the financial district right now, after all.
Gonna make a buck.
Yes. But we want to essentially argue that doing 50 sets per week for a single muscle group, even if that muscle group is the quads, is not such a wild thing. And if 2 relatively strong individuals, big individuals, we're both weighing 230 plus pounds at the moment, near 240, can do it without any preparation and in a relatively time efficient manner, then it's not really a big deal.
For sure. There's a few caveats with this study. Number 1 is between sets, they took 2 minutes of rest, or at least 2 minutes of rest. Now, for me personally, set to set, that means I'll be dropping load probably like 5% or more. And so by set 9, you're really not squatting that heavy anymore, for example.
Yes.
And so that's worth keeping in mind. It's not the same as if you did 26 sets of quads in a session, but you were resting 5 or 10 minutes between sets. That would be a different thing altogether.
For sure.
The second thing is, not every set was taken to failure. So in a lot of studies, all sets are, at least, they attempt to take every set to failure. In this study, all sets were taken to RPE 8, or 2 repetitions in the tank before failure, except for the last set on each exercise. The data we have on training to failure versus not training to failure does suggest that training to failure is more fatiguing. So perhaps, even though we're doing a lot of sets here, just by keeping a couple reps in the tank, it might not be as fatiguing as you might expect. And certainly, if participants had 10 weeks to build up to this, and it's only 4 total sessions of 26 sets of quads.
Exactly.
Personally, I don't find it that hard to believe.
Same. It was just quads. Keep in mind, they weren't doing 50 sets for everything, and at the same time, they started at 22 and gradually built up. Sure, they had that one or those 2 crazy weeks at the end, but again, it's not really an unimaginable training program. Anecdotally, at least, we've seen Tom Platt's workouts, we've seen 10 by 10s, we've seen small loft. As lifters, I would argue that if you think that this workout, especially if you mimic the study procedure and the length of the study like to a T, if you think that it's not really doable, then you've probably not really lifted seriously.
You feel me?
Yes.
On a real note, part of the reason we're doing this is because after posting some memes about this study online and seeing some of the controversy around, a lot of people really didn't think it was possible. Like, some people straight up said, oh, the study's bullshit, or it didn't happen, or shit like that, when in reality, it's very feasible. And you were mentioning Tom Platz, even people like Ronnie Coleman and Arnold, if you look at their routines, times per session, they were doing 30 to 40 sets, presumably pretty close to failure.
Per session though, and that's for everything.
Yeah.
And that's not in a lab with research assistants over your head, guiding you, loading the plates for you. That's also very important to consider. These people were not going to the gym by themselves and carrying out the whole session. They were in a controlled environment with assistants, both physical assistants as far as like loading the bar, adjusting the weight and so on and so forth, plus verbal encouragement, which makes, it's a hard workout, don't get me wrong, but it's not an impossible sort of feat of strength.
A common complaint about studies is that the people taking part really didn't lift, and so it doesn't really generalize to how you might be training, right? You, dear viewer of Wolf Coaching or Dr. Pack's channel, for sure, you squat 7 plates per side. If you don't, I'm not sure how you got here. You make 8 figures minimum at least.
Yes, exactly.
It is what it is. And so if you're looking at a study of people squatting 1 plate per side, maybe you just don't relate. And maybe the findings from that study don't actually apply to you because you're a freak. In this case, they actually squatted 3 plates per side as a limit max, 2 parallel. That's actually pretty respectable. That's like early intermediate level strength.
For sure. And they were around 80 kilos of body weight.
Sure, so it's nearly a 2 times body weight squat.
Yeah.
Which means, in all likelihood, it generalizes to the vast majority of the gym population. Because most people who have been training for like a couple of years. You get relatively few people who have been training for like 10 plus years anyways. So, relatively generalizable findings. But today, let's see whether or not we can do it.
For sure. And one last thing is that because they had a 1 RM of 130 kilos and they were squatting either for 6 to 8 reps or 10 to 12 reps, the weight that they were using was probably 2 plates and below, especially as they were going towards their latter sets.
For sure.
So again, this is not a world champion powerlifter or a group of world champion powerlifters squatting 8 plates for 52 sets in 7 hours. It's just a bunch of intermediates doing a hard leg workout, supervised and in a controlled environment. All right, my brother, time to get rhabdo.
Let's do it.
See you in the gym. Yeah. Get the money ready. Yeah.
So, starting off the session, we warmed up with the barbell and gradually worked up to about 150-ish, 160 kilograms. I was purposely going beltless because I figured the less effort I could expend by putting on a belt and taking it off after every set, and by having less constriction on being able to breathe during these squats, I thought all of that would make it easier. And additionally, the fact that I wasn't wearing a belt meant I could use a little bit less weight. So that was my first set right there. You could see the last rep. It was supposed to be about 2 reps in reserve, keep in mind. So the last rep was supposed to be reasonably hard, but I was supposed to have 2 more reps or so in the tank. Now, for Pack's first set, even though I'm standing in the frame, again, I think it was about 2 reps in reserve, maybe slightly more than that. But honestly, the first couple sets were reasonably easy. Because rest times weren't really impacting this stuff yet, it just felt like a regular squat session. Like, I was about as strong as usual, things felt okay. The second set was a bit rougher. Obviously, when you've only rested for 2.5 minutes between sets of squats, you do feel a bit messed up. But yeah, the squats initially were pretty feasible. However, things gradually got worse and worse. And in fact, you'll see that the weight drops on the squats by between 5 all the way to 15% towards the end per set. So on set 1, I was using around 160 kilograms or maybe around 330 to 350 pounds. By the last set, I was down to about 180. In fact, here you can see me using 315 already, and I'm only on set 3. And some people have criticized me for using a more bodybuilding style technique here, aka pausing at the bottom, not spending a ton of time with the lockout, etc. To be honest, that's just how I train. I don't think it necessarily makes it easier. I think, in fact, it makes it harder in some regards and easier in other regards. But some people have criticized me for not using a more sort of power building-y technique. I don't think it really matters. Within the study, there were no constraints posed on tempo or technique, and therefore I don't think it should have been cause for disqualification in this case. At least in the good Lyle McDonald's eyes. Now, I think this is set number 4 here, and by this point it was starting to get quite challenging. The pump in my legs was such that I couldn't really lock out my legs, and you can kind of see it here already, like I'm struggling to walk it back in. My quads are doing all sorts of weird things at lockout, which is indicative of, hey, I've got a substantial pump and disruption in the quads. I didn't really feel this lift anywhere but my quads, to be honest. Like, I did get some glute cramping, adductor cramping, etc., but that was minimal. Rest times were generally kept around 2.5 to 3 minutes here between sets. The whole session took us about an hour and 40. The cramping was starting to get to me here. You can see the load had to drop substantially. It's already down to about 265 from the looks of it. You can see in my face that I am not having the best of times. But see, here again, with the quads, the lockout was challenging. By set 5 or set 4 or so is when it really started getting challenging. So once again, as we mentioned in the intro, we weren't really ready for this session. A couple days beforehand, we done a couple sets of squats to get an idea of what working might be using. I've been doing exclusively lengthened partials in my training pretty much for about a year now, and as such don't really have a good gauge of what's my full range of motion strength like. And so I just needed to make sure I knew, but beyond that, we were both very unprepared. Pack to a greater extent, but myself too. But we thought, hey, let's give it a shot. It's for $1,000, and it's to prove that even people who were not particularly prepared for this session could still accomplish it. So here you see me starting to really drop that working weight down to 235, 245 or something like that. Really not a lot of weight. But to be honest, the biggest challenge here was just nausea and the pump, the soreness, like even just walking to the rack, getting underneath the bar was painful. I think honestly, during the squats around set 5 or 6 is when I was like, ooh, am I actually going to make it? The difficulty was like 8 out of 10. But we persevered, you know, we kept going. Here I'm down to 225, which if I was fresh, I'm not sure how many reps I'd get. I'd get probably like 20 reps or so, maybe more. But at this point, it was so heavy and my legs were so messed up that I actually failed 225 after, I believe, 5 or 6 reps, as you can see here, and I'm just about crawling out from underneath the bar. Shout out to the research assistants, though. So these are actually some of the students under Brad Schoenfeld. So this was all done in Brad Schoenfeld's lab. And Max Coleman, Ryan Burke, all of the other students, awesome. Also shout out to Rico, a friend of ours, for helping unload the bar and load the bar between sets. Really helpful. But again, even within the context of the study, they did have someone looking over them, encouraging them, just like we did in this case. But here you see me down to under 2 plates for the squat. And that was, you know, it was rough. And obviously these squats are sped up, so it doesn't really give you an appreciation of how fatigued I was by here. But here you can kind of see like, okay, like the bar even lowered here a little bit and dropped back down. So that gives you an idea of how fatigued I was by this point. And honestly, the whole session was like a difficulty of 8 out of 10, but the squats were like a 8 to 9 out of 10. Like I could have done a little bit more sets or a little bit closer to failure or what have you, but this was a pretty damn hard session to get through. Pac at this point was also feeling the effects. I think Pac was having it even worse than me because he's really not used to training legs that much. He hasn't really trained legs very much in a few years, to be honest. But he started squatting recently again, but he was not ready at all for this, even less so than I was. And he can see me squatting like 155 or whatever it is, which not a lot of weight for me if I was fresh, but by set 8 or 9 or whatever this was, it was a lot of weight. This might in fact be the last set. It looks like I might fail this one. Yeah, that's not going anywhere. I really tried to push through here, and you can see it by how the bar was gradually dropping as opposed to just letting it go instantly. But that wasn't going anywhere. And I think this might be Pac's last set of squats in this case. He was struggling. Like, you could tell he was very nauseated as well. He was very close to throwing up, and I think he did throw up in the end, just after squats. So it was rough. I think if we'd had sufficient rest, it would have been a different situation where maybe we would have been able to get through it a little bit more easily, but the loads would have been much greater. So it's kind of a trade-off there. But yeah, his pack after his last set of squats, absolutely crushed, just like I was. Max Coleman slyly looking over him. But yeah, that was essentially the squats. Now, after the squats, we're supposed to move on to leg press. Honestly, the squats were by far the hardest part. Going into leg press, I was like, okay, how's this going to go? Because like you can see me here, I'm struggling to even get into position. My knees were all over the place. The leg press wasn't great. It's not a great machine. But hey, it's what we had in the lab, so that's what we used. And around this point is when Pac basically said, look, I'm gonna bail. Ultimately, the prize money, the $1,000 for successfully completing the challenge, wasn't actually something that two of us could get. So as long as one of us finished the session, we're fine. And Pac more so joined along for the experience of it, for the memories, not necessarily because he was intending on finishing the whole session. Whereas for me, it was like, look, let me really give this my all. I think, I could use the money, straight up. Hey, gotta support the YouTube channel, gotta buy better video equipment, gotta do all that. Entrepreneur, #Sigma, #grindset. But equally, I think it's a good way to prove, hey, this session can be done. Even if you're somewhat more trained than the participants. Even if you're not as prepared as the participants. The participants had 10 weeks to build up to this. And so I just wanted to prove, look, this can be done. Especially in the face of some more vocal critics like Lyle McDonald, who, to be honest, do often argue in bad faith. And therefore, I wanted to go through it and do a good job. As I said, though, it wasn't the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was like an 8 or 9 out of 10. So to think it's unfeasible or impossible for the average intermediate to do, especially having built up to it, it's just unreasonable. And if you genuinely think that, either you're coming from a very different place from mine in terms of training experience and background, maybe you don't really lift, or I don't really know, but it is very feasible. Pac did one set of leg press. I think it was a warm-up set or one actual set, and then was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to throw up. This is not worth my time. Again, the prize money is only going out to one person. And therefore, he called it quits there, and that's kind of what we had discussion around. But leg press, honestly, was substantially easier. Just being able to sit down during the set and not have my glutes and adductors be, I don't know, maybe it's placebo, but they didn't feel quite as involved as they did during the squat. But again, even with the leg press, I'm only really used to length and partials, and so maybe that added to my difficulties at lockout, where my quads were just shaking all over the place. But it was a weird feeling. The pump was monumental. As far as my preparation going into the session went, there were a few things I did. One, I had some caffeine when I woke up, about 5 hours before this. And then I had one meal as soon as I woke up, so about 5 or 6 hours before this session. But then I didn't eat on purpose in the 5 or 6 hours before the session. I also purposely kept my fats during that one meal very low. Fats do slow down digestion and can cause nausea during a session if they're had too close before a session. And so I just made sure that I didn't have many fats in my stomach, otherwise that honestly would have thrown me off. And I think that might have been the differentiating factor in part between Pac's performance and mine, is that I was relatively careful with my nutrition before the session. The other thing I did was buy 2 300 milligrams of caffeine rain drinks energy drinks before the session. Now, 600 milligrams for me is a high dose, and in fact, if you look at the research, 4 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight seems to be the most ergogenic dose for strength, maximal strength, and sort of strength endurance, aka high rep work. And so 600 milligrams for me was right in that range, given that I weighed around 110 kilograms or about 242 pounds at the time. And I had those half an hour to an hour before the session. The final thing we did, and this was in response to reading some of the literature or the case studies on rhabdomyolysis, it seemed like most of the people who ever got rhabdo really got it as a result of A, training pretty hard with high volumes, and B, being dehydrated. And that involved often people going out to drink in the evening, or not sufficiently hydrating during the day, or exercising in a very hot environment, all things that would promote hypohydration. And so one thing I made a huge point of, and that we both purchased, was to get several Gatorade drinks with salt, sugar, aka salt electrolytes, potassium, and so forth, to maximize hydration and rehydration specifically. Because one of the big things otherwise with hypohydration, one of the only real known causes of cramping is hypohydration. So if you're experiencing a lot of cramps, paying attention to your hydration and making sure you maximize that as best you can is important. Now, shout out to Max Coleman, as you can see in the frame here, for taking note of all the sets being done. I think this was around set 5. Honestly, the session was kind of getting easier as it went on, because at this point, those 6 to 7 reps on leg press weren't really enough to cause much further pain, and because of how fatigued I was, it kind of felt like I was pushing, but I couldn't really push that much weight anymore. So at this point, it was getting more and more feasible, and honestly, it felt like the leg extensions were going to be a bit of a victory lap. What's worth keeping in mind, though, is on the squats from set 1 to set 9, because again, 9 sets of squats, 9 sets of leg press, and 8 sets of leg extensions, the weight did drop off by about 50%. So from about 350 to about 185, which is a substantial drop. So by the time I got to leg press, the weight I was pushing was really not that substantial. So, as far as how Lyle McDonald, the person who posed the challenge, responded afterwards, to be honest, in our interactions, to his credit, he was pretty solid. He was somewhat charitable, although I don't think there were any grounds to not be charitable with this video. Like, for the most part, everything went according to plan, and if anything, I think I trained a little bit harder than the participants in the study, where some sets I failed where they didn't fail. They were supposed to train to 2 reps in reserve. Like here, for example, I'm extremely close to failure, I actually failed a rep, whereas in the study, they were only supposed to fail the last set. So he was charitable, and in fact, he did pay up, spoiler. But what I will say is that since then, he has been anything but charitable. And that kind of goes hand in hand with his reputation and what you hear about him from other people, is that he can be quite aggressive and unnecessarily critical of new studies and acting in bad faith and that sort of stuff. And to be honest, while Lyle isn't dumb, right? Like, he has some knowledge in the sports science field. He also isn't someone I would particularly go to for information or evidence. I don't think he's that knowledgeable. So I would say, if you can, stay away. So then I moved on to leg extensions. You can see me sipping on that Gatorade to remain hydrated, avoid cramping, and delay fatigue as much as possible. These did have sugar in them as well, which hopefully, potentially provided an enhancement to performance. The data around carbohydrates within your session isn't actually that compelling, at least unless you're performing super high workloads. But as it turns out, this is one of those sessions where workload is so high that it might actually have helped out. But usually, intra-workout carbohydrate intake isn't necessarily going to lead to better performance or better hypertrophy from that session. Now, leg extensions honestly were a victory lap. This machine was, pardon my language, an absolute piece of shit. It was by far the hardest at lockout, and there was essentially no resistance at the top. So if you're looking at these reps and thinking, wow, those look a bit odd or a bit too easy, honestly, lockout was the only hard part. So you can see at the bottom, it's essentially just accelerating, and at the top, it just takes a while to lock out eventually, which is the case with most leg extensions, but this machine in particular was even worse. With regards to the soreness after the session, honestly, it was a new benchmark. If you look at the data on soreness and swelling and so forth, what you see is that the main things that will cause soreness, the main one really is novelty, so anything you haven't really done before, mainly in terms of exercise selection, but also in terms of contraction type and volume. And so in this case, I haven't done leg extensions in a while. I haven't done full range of motion squats in a while. I haven't done leg press with full range of motion in a while. And I certainly hadn't done 26 sets of quads in the same session. And so this was super novel for both Pac and I, which meant that the soreness was expected to be large. The second thing that causes a lot of soreness typically is a large degree of eccentric contractions. So the protocol typically used by researchers when they were trying to induce muscle damage and to some extent soreness is large volumes of unaccustomed to eccentric contractions. And this was kind of that. So I was expecting a lot of soreness. It was unaccustomed to. 26 sets is nowhere near the ballpark of what I typically do. And yet I was still able to go through it. But the soreness was honestly like, if I had a scale out of 10, with 10 being the largest amount of soreness, it would be a 10. And that was in spite of one of the strategies we used after the session. So about maybe 3 hours, 4 hours after the session, when we got home, I did the unthinkable. And that is, we bought some ice from the nearest 7-Eleven. We were staying somewhere in New York. We went home, we put it in the bathtub, we added, we let the water sink in, and we plunged into a cold water ice bath for about 15-20 minutes. Now, I wouldn't recommend this usually if, you're trying to maximize hypertrophy. Going into a cold water bath after a session is a bad idea, and I've got a video about that on the channel. But in this case, it was genuinely just how do we reduce soreness and make the next few days bearable. I think we were actually flying back from New York to London the next day after a month of staying in New York to help out with research. And so we didn't really want to have cripplingly sore quads. So I went for a cold water ice bath, and I think that helped. I think that did help. Otherwise, we just then chilled out for the rest of the night. I felt super sleepy after the session, in spite of 600 milligrams of caffeine before the session. And I think that was just attributable to, the workload involved within the session. But yeah, one thing I'll say is, as you saw in the intro, we were both pretty confident going into it. And in hindsight, it was definitely feasible. Like past 4 or 5 sets of squats, there was really no more doubt in my mind that I was going to achieve the whole session. But it was hard. I think I might have been a bit overconfident going into it. And, by the time I got to set 4 or 5 of squats, I was like, okay, this is going to be a bit more challenging than I thought. But at some point, there was no more doubt about my ability to actually successfully finish the session. One other interesting component of this is I was actually weighing about 240 here, which is the heaviest I've been in a few years. Hey, I think that's the session done. Hey, we are done. But yeah, I was at my heaviest here, which might have played a role as well. That's the session done. Getting congratulatory hugs, shaking hands, and yeah.
All right, here we are, done after the session here at Lehman College, as you can see, in the VFX 3D animation rooms that Lehman College has for people to go in and chat after they do grueling sessions when they've been challenged by certain individuals online. How are you, my friend Milo?
I'm good. It seems like just yesterday or just an hour ago that I did the like session, when in reality it was 8 days ago.
8 days ago. Just for full transparency, we did record a debrief directly after the session, but for some reason the sound is poor. So, we only like rich things in this circle. Unless the sound is making 8 figures, we don't want that sort of sound. So we're back with richer sounds.
I mean, look, we started the video on a rooftop in Manhattan, and now we're in some sort of closet space in the UK. So we really downgraded.
What's on the wrist, though?
What's on the wrist, though, indeed. So how was the session for you? You quit after squats, correct?
Yes, I quit after squats. I joined the session for the camaraderie and the ments. But once we finished with squats and I did a set of leg press, I was feeling really nauseous because we were trying to really keep to the 2 minutes or roughly 2 minutes of rest that the participants did. The manuscript did say a minimum of 2 minutes, but given the fact that this was a challenge for money, we didn't want to take the piss or risk being called out for resting, 4 to 6 minutes, which I would normally do. And given the fact that I wasn't going to get paid and that it was your show, I felt like, you know what, it's not worth me puking or feeling horrible just to finish the session. 9 sets of squats was already like 1,000% increase as far as training volume goes. It was a very hard session, but as you can see, like you did it impromptu and you were unprepared as well. And you're somebody who's very strong, very muscular, who can squat, a lot of weight. So I don't see how this is an impossible session, especially for participants that started at 22 sets of quads and then gradually built up over the course of 3 months. So yeah, that's my feedback.
I do agree with that. Although I will say, you mentioned not wanting to vomit, but off camera, you did then go off and in fact throw up a little bit, right?
It was the fake vomit. So it was like we were drinking Gatorade during the session just to stay hydrated, because the one sort of thing that we were trying to be on top of is that we're not used to the rest time, so we're sweating more than usual. So yeah, we were sipping on Gatorade, and I went off camera and had to like puke some of the Gatorade out. But I can't claim, I can't get the respect of the puking crew.
Okay,
it
Mike,
wasn't like,
yeah,
it was that kind of puke.
A bit of flagging, essentially.
Yes, indeed.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's interesting because both of us usually take much longer rest times than what was prescribed in the study. Like on average, between sets of lower body compound work, typically, honestly, I'll take between 5 and 12 minutes, up to 12 minutes sometimes for like hard sets, what have you. So going from that to resting on average 2 or 3 minutes between sets of squats was, I think, the biggest challenge. It resulted in a bunch of weight drop-off set to set. And towards set 4 or 5 or something is when I started being like, oh, maybe I'm not going to make it through here. And the squats were definitely the most challenging part of the session. I think the leg press and leg extensions were a lot easier.
100%.
So you kind of quit after the hardest part, so you can take pride in that. I will say, again, within the context of the study, I think it's certainly achievable. What about the soreness, though? I think we did something afterwards that we might want to mention to reduce soreness and not be completely wrecked the next day, given how unprepared we were, right? Because both of us come from a relatively low volume background.
Super low. Like I was from a almost non-existent volume, and you were doing, 10 sets per week, if that.
Most, yeah.
At the most. And keep in mind, 10 sets of various exercises, at your own pace and split into 2 different sessions. So what we did was, aside from eating like kings, so we went for sushi and obviously slept well and stuff, but we also did an ice bath. I mean, a fake ice bath, because we only bought like 1 bag of ice each. And it was more like I'm lying in relatively cold water. Like I had to move to feel the cold. So that's what we did.
Yeah, basically we just immersed ourselves in cold water, like tap water, which was usually tap water is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you add in some ice, depending on how much ice you add, it might be about 55. And typically in the cold water immersion data, people use 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 to 15 degrees Celsius for about 10 to 20 minutes. And that's kind of what we did. So hopefully it should have given us some of the benefits for recovery, not for muscle growth. For muscle growth, it's a no-go. But for recovery, might have helped with sort of pain. And anecdotally, I kind of went from being completely destroyed in my quads, glutes, adductors to being still destroyed, but at least feeling like my legs weren't so sore that I could barely walk.
And just for the record, so on that day, I did about 10,000 steps. And then the next day, we hit, because we were doing everything together in New York, we hit about 17,000 steps. So even though, we were pretty sore and it was a brutal workout, it's not like we did it and then had to be, bedridden for 3 weeks. Life went on as usual, just super sore.
For sure. So overall, if you had to rate how achievable that session was within the context of the study, how would you rate it?
That's a weird rating scale.
Make it up, bro. Out of 10.
8 out of 10. I don't know.
The study happened, 80% chance. You heard it here, folks. Lyle McDonald wins again.
I just wanted to say, though, because we're being too scientific now and people will come at you and at us with all the copes, is like, one thing I want to highlight is that, look, this workout was done impromptu by an individual who was much bigger and much stronger than the individuals that took part in the study, because that's a cope people usually tend to make with resistance training studies, where they say, they were trained, but they weren't that trained. So in this case, you get somebody who has squatted 200 kilos for reps multiple times, ass to grass with a pause, etc. That just randomly went in and did, 300, 400, 500% more volume than they usually do. Rested much less than they usually do, which is difficult, especially when you're not used to that sort of fatigue and that sort of nauseous feeling. And did the study in less time than the participants. So if we want to be, bro about it, totally doable.
For sure. So I guess a few questions on the back of that. Number one, do you think that Lyle McDonald will give us the money?
I don't see how he can't. I mean, he's taking a long time analyzing the video. I am not sure exactly what's being analyzed. I was there, and obviously, I'm biased. I can see how 1 or 2 sets from my end may have been further than 2 reps in reserve. And keep in mind, the manuscript did say approximately 2 reps in reserve. And if we factor in meta-analytic data on the ability of individuals to gauge repetitions in reserve, showing that they may be imperfect by 1 repetition, it may be that some participants were, at 3 or 1 rep in reserve or whatever. But I was there, and you can clearly see on the video that all your sets are definitely at 2 RIR, if not less than that, with the last set being actually to failure, with you failing and dumping the bar or us helping you on the leg press or whatever. He should give us the money, give you the money, but I don't know. I can see maybe some paralysis by analysis cope where he then throws the ball back at you and says, do you really think this was as hard as it should have been, or something?
For sure.
I don't know.
I will say the one situation where I would actually push to true 2 reps in reserve and to failure would be this session, because I'm being offered $1,000 to do so. And for context, the way I prepared for this session was A, getting plenty of hydration and drinking plenty of fluids so that we don't get rhabdo, just in case that was ever a risk. It's very unlikely based on what we've sort of read, but hey, rather safe than sorry. And so we drank plenty of fluids, but the other thing I did was have 600 milligrams of caffeine in about the space of half an hour before the session. So if there was ever a time where I was ready to go to war, it was that session. So hopefully that won't be a hiccup with successfully completing the session.
Yeah, and there was quite a few people there. There was at least like 3 people cheering you on. We had music on. It was a proper session. We weren't messing about. But again, from the video, if the video footage is the only source of information that is used to judge whether the workout happened as it should have been or not, I don't think there's much doubt. We saw some comments in Lyle's group trying to make the claim that you weren't being truthful with your effort or that you were faking it. But I mean, that's always going to be a limitation, right? You can't really prove that somebody's actually going to failure.
One of the claims was also that my technique was too bodybuilder style, and that's a bad thing. It was bro, the guidelines in the study were squat to at least parallel, and that was it. Like, besides that, you could do whatever you wanted. And so it's a very weird critique to me, but hey.
And for most people, when they hear bodybuilding style, they think of potentially less strict technique where you're doing like sort of half reps, whereas you were going ass to grass, pausing on most reps, I think.
Every rep.
Ass to grass, super low, definitely below powerlifting depth.
Yep.
It's like, if anything, you made it harder.
Yep.
But cool, guys, look. This was the highest volume, one of the highest volume workouts of the study, because they did
the
2.
highest.
The highest, yeah, sorry. But it wasn't like the full week because there was one more workout left. Guy went, did it completely unprepared, did things completely against his usual sort of training, did it in less time than the participants, is a big guy, super strong guy. I don't know what else we can say there. Like, obviously, cool. If we can do it again, we can. We're not doing it. We're not doing it again.
For sure. In closing, give me $1,000. Thank you.
Yeah, $1,000 faster. Big shout out. And just to close off this video, the way we should be doing it. Let's end it with
it pisses sick.
It is
Milo Wolf, the big scientist, the sickening sharp.
Milo Wolf, the big scientist.
The big science, he even says. He even mispronounced scientist.
Shout out Jason Genova.
That's the
Money
video.
Faster.
Now on screen, you'll see whether or not I actually got the money in the end. If you like the video, comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in that next one.
Peace.